Good morning, Merry Christmas, and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm Ken Rice. On this Christmas Eve, how should we reflect on the year that is about to pass? We've seen natural disasters from hurricanes to forest fires, unprecedented overdose deaths from opioids, and a series of mass shootings and terror attacks in schools, in subways. Many communities are struggling with unemployment and hunger. This morning on the KDPG Sunday Edition, do the spirit, the meaning of Christmas provide a message about how to face the future? We've invited 3 local religious leaders to join us and share their thoughts. A little later, we'll meet Susan Rosher of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Pittsburgh. But right now, we welcome Reverend Liddy Barlow, Executive Minister of Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, and Reverend Dr. Richard Wingfield, Pastor of Unity Baptist Church in Braddock. David Shribman is away this week. Chris Potter, politics writer for the Post-Gazette, joins us. Chris, nice to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Thanks to both of you. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Same to you.
As you think about the year that has passed and you think about what message will be shared at Christmas gatherings, what are your thoughts? How do you sum up where we've been over the course of 2017, Reverend?
2017 has been a difficult year for many of our parishioners in our congregation. We've had a number of deaths. We've had to deal with violence within our community, in particular within the Woodland Hills School District, and people are kind of down. So my message on Christmas is going to be, or Christmas Eve today actually, is going to be about lifting up people's spirit, giving them joy in the midst of the struggles that they have been going through, helping them to realize that even though things might be difficult, even though things might be rough for them, there is still hope on the horizon.
And Reverend Barlow, tell us what you do as executive minister, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. So I serve as executive minister of Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, which is Southwest Pennsylvania's regional Christian unity organization. So I work with 28 different church bodies, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox, trying to make the real unity of the church more visible in our region. So I don't have a pulpit to preach in tonight on Christmas Eve, but if I did, I have been thinking a lot about Mary's song this Christmas season, the Magnificat, which is a song that Mary, the mother of Jesus, sings in the first chapter of Luke, celebrating her pregnancy and what God is doing through the life of this child that is coming. And Mary really sings as a revolutionary. She says, God has cast the mighty down from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. And so I'm thinking this Christmas about how we as Christians have a responsibility to lift up the lowly in our communities and to make the hope and joy that we find in Christmas more visible to all people in our communities, not just the wealthy and powerful.
And does it seem to you that this is a year when that message is particularly necessary, really needs to be heard?
I think it is. I think there's a lot of fear in our communities this year, and
based on what?
Based on a lot of factors. I mean, I think we've seen rising tides of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination in our communities in recent times. I think a lot of people are concerned about their finances, even in a time when many are experiencing prosperity. I think there are many in our communities that are still experiencing concern about feeding their families and keeping a roof over their heads. And I think the opioid epidemic has been affecting so many families. Families from every walk of life have been impacted by that.
On the other hand, I'm curious, you may have heard that we've won the war on Christmas. Apparently, Donald Trump now says it's okay to say Merry Christmas again. And I'm curious, as we're in this season, how you both feel as ministers about the way the sort of war on Christmas and this season has kind of been politicized, because it seems so many things have been. One of the legacies of 2017 is even football is now politicized now, right? So how have you felt about that? Do you feel that that issue has sort of been dragged into a political debate that it shouldn't be? And how do you feel about people's ability to profess their faith in this society right now?
I don't have a problem with it. In fact, I just told my congregation recently that we don't need presidential proclamations or anything from the Congress to say Merry Christmas. That's the season. We oftentimes say, it sounds kind of cliche-ish, but we often say that Jesus is the reason for the season, and he is, because were it not for Jesus, we wouldn't really have a need to celebrate. So we don't have a problem saying Merry Christmas.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm not sure that Christmas really needs our defense. I think Christmas can stand for itself. I also recognize that Christmas is one of many holidays that Americans celebrate at this time of year. So I certainly don't feel offended when someone wishes me happy holidays, because I'm also celebrating New Year's Day and Thanksgiving and a variety of holidays in this whole festive season. I certainly think that all people should be able to freely practice their faith. But I think Americans might do better to look to our fellow Christians in other parts of the world who really are struggling to be able to profess and practice their faith. I think, having a cashier wish you happy holidays is not necessarily the worst way that we can be oppressed.
So this is a time of year that is exciting, it's joyful, but it's also stressful. It can be very lonely. What do you find with your congregation at this time of year? For some people, it is a dark time of year.
It is. In fact, I just saw earlier where I have a cousin who just said, I'm just not in the Christmas spirit this year, because he just recently experienced death in his family. I have many congregants who really get down around this time of year because they're experiencing loss, or they've experienced loss around this time of the year. And they really need their spirits lifted. And one of the ways that we do that is by fellowship amongst the congregation. We just celebrated a Christmas gathering with our church, and just the time to come together and tell everybody how much we appreciate them and we love on them, and just celebrate this holiday season.
There's this mad rush every December. People have to do what they have to do to get ready for the holiday, to buy gifts, to prepare for family, prepare perhaps to travel. Can you picture a different type of Christmas culture where it was a rush to volunteer, and a rush to create fellowship, sort of a different type of frenzy that might be more, it just might be different.
Sure. I don't even have to imagine. That's how the Advent season originated in Christian history. That Advent was, so Advent is the season of the four, that includes the 4 Sundays before Christmas Day. And historically, Advent was a season of spiritual preparation. So it was a time of prayer. It was a time of repentance. We usually read the stories of John the Baptist, who sort of insists that, if God is coming, we've got to change our lives. So let's examine ourselves and change our lives. It was a time of fasting, which is a practice that our Orthodox Christian brothers and sisters still do during the Advent season. So it's we don't have to dig too far into our heritage to discover what a different kind of Advent would look like.
And I'm not saying it's not there, but it does seem to be overshadowed by the commercial aspects, and that's certainly not a real fresh observation I recognize.
Sure.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was interested, Reverend Wingfield, earlier on you said that in Braddock, where you minister, that there have been some tough times for folks. And I think a lot of people who don't live in Braddock but have been hearing about it, largely because of its very charismatic mayor, John Fetterman, have sort of this spirit, have this sense of Braddock as a place that's on the rebound and coming back. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk a little bit about how your congregants are doing, both in terms of their just social well-being, but spiritually as well.
I think Braddock has been on the rise here for the last few years. I think Braddock has received a bad rap over the years, but I think the rebounding of Braddock is very vital to the congregation in particular. People need to realize that what's happening in Braddock is not just an economic piece, but there is a spiritual revival taking place in Braddock. Our church is on the go. Our church is on the grow. We're trying to impact the community, because I believe that the church that does not impact the community that it's in ceases to be the church. And so we're trying to make an impact in the community by touching lives of people and building them up. And I think that's our challenge in this particular holiday season.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, because one of the debates that's going on politically, which is what I do, I don't get to talk to people of God very often in that job. Most of my interviews are in the devil's train. But politically, there's a lot of talk right now about children's insurance programs and sort of what the government's obligation to people is. And there's a sort of question out there amongst conservatives who say, look, the Bible tells us to take care of the least among us, but that's an individual responsibility, or a responsibility for charities and churches. It's not something the government should do. And I'm curious, first of all, what you kind of think about that reading of Scripture, and second of all, can churches like yours that are involved in these communities, can they do it on their own without that kind of government support?
So at the time when the Bible was put together, there really wasn't as much of an understanding of an individualistic society as there is today. So many of the commandments especially throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, but I think in the New Testament as well, are directed not so much towards individuals, but towards a whole people. There's also a lot of psalms that talk about, that pray for a righteous king, that the king will rule with justice. And we don't live in a monarchy, so that makes all of us the kings here in our society. And so we're the ones that need to enact justice through public policy. I think that it's really a shame in this season when Jesus came as a helpless newborn baby, that something as basic as childcare, health insurance for children is at risk. I think that the stories of this season should inspire us to make sure that we can take care of all the kids in our communities.
Just before we wrap up the segment, something else that may be at risk, some in the charitable community feel that charitable contributions may be at risk because of a change in the tax laws that says that it's going to encourage a lot of people to just take a standard deduction. Right. And it means that they might not be itemizing in a way where at the end of the year they're going to think, oh, I want to give $5, $10, $50 to whatever charitable organization. Do you have fears that that's going to affect charitable organizations like your own?
It can. I would not doubt that. But, you know, we've been living on a shoestring budget for years anyway, you know, but it can affect what we seek to do within the community. But what we really believe is the fact that if we are intentional about seeking to reach the community, God's going to provide the resources for us to do what we really need to do.
On that note, we will take a break. Thank you both so much. We will continue our discussion with Catholic Charities, what they're doing to help people at this time of year. More of the KDPG Sunday Edition in just a moment.